USAID Administrator Samantha Power is due to visit Addis Ababa. She says her visit is to press the government of Ethiopia to allow full and unhindered humanitarian access to prevent famine in Ethiopia's Tigray region. But many are voicing concern that this is part of a conspiracy of opening up a so-called humanitarian corridor to arm the TPLF and weaken Ethiopia through prolonged conflicts. We have produced the following story in this regard. In her own words, Samantha Power is coming to Ethiopia to press the government of Ethiopia to allow full and unhindered humanitarian access to prevent famine in Ethiopia's Tigray region. But while Ethiopia is a sovereign nation with all the legal mandate to decide on major routes and corridors, the Western world is erroneously pressurizing the East African nation to open up the Sudanese border. This, according to many Ethiopians, is a recipe for disaster. Ethiopians have already begun voicing disapproval of her visit, as there should not be free corridor in any sovereign country, and also such requests by aid agencies that endangers the security and safety of the country. There has been a conspiracy on the part of the TPLF and its Western cronies to have the Sudanese corridor opened. The TPLF has come up with its so-called border issue of the Wolkite so that Ethiopian armed forces leave the border town of Humara. If and when this happens, then the TPLF and its allies will use the corridor for unhindered access to weapons. In an article featured on The Star, an Ethiopian political analyst, Wasan Malaku, with years of experience in teaching and research, writes that starvation must be averted by all means. However, in trying to press the government of Ethiopia to allow full and unhindered humanitarian access to Tigray, the writer urges her to understand the situation on the ground better. Critical as humanitarian access is, it is not necessarily in the gift of the Ethiopian government alone. The senseless war imposed by the TPLF has made access to Tigray a dangerous adventure. While Power's initiative is noble in the words of the writer, the USAID chief must have lost the real picture when she laid everything on the Ethiopian government, arguing that the TPLF was using hunger as a means of blockade and trying to win the Western attention. The writer calls for caution, citing that the TPLF is leaving no stone unturned to undeservedly use the genocide claim for its purpose. The writer urges Power to understand the reality as a former seasoned journalist with exposure to gripping stories like the Bosnia War. Samantha Power, the writer argues, might still be unduly influenced by the press rather than wait for clear evidence, so she is accused of reaching unwarranted conclusion on the make-believe genocide claims flung on the Ethiopian government by the likes of Christoph. Christoph is writing and tweeting on Ethiopia Today, routinely and wrongly accusing the Ethiopian government of deliberately starving its citizens in Tigray and praising the distorted, malicious, and irresponsible reporting by his NYT colleague Dilkan Welsh. The writer urges Power to allow herself the patience to watch, listen, and learn, just as her younger self did in Croatia back then, that the Amharas and Tigrayans are not Serbs and Croats. Ethiopia is not Yugoslavia. According to the writer, the war is imposed on Ethiopia by a criminal gang bent on returning itself to power to play Act 2 of its quasi-apartheid minority rule over the rest of Ethiopia. The people of Tigray are its primary victims, considered only as a tool for its selfish agenda. No group is more hated and despised than the TPLF in Ethiopia today or ever. The writer urges Power to listen to her hostess during her time in Addis. He says, "I recall how frustrated Miss Power was when Aung San Suu Kyi rejected her commendable attempts to persuade her to condemn the persecution of the Rohingya during her visit in 2012. In making the case for congressional authorization of the use of force against Assad in 2015, Ms. Power wrote memorably, quote, "I believed that the most important part of decision-making was not the justness of one's intentions, but the effectiveness of one's actions." this time on Ethiopia. Her humanitarian cause is just but the background. Diplomatic saber-rattling is worrying with potentially catastrophic consequences. The writer says, I urge Ms. Power and her government to exercise caution. The whole world is watching, Africa even more so. Ethiopia matters. In fact, the TPLF bandits and its diaspora allies are openly denouncing Ethiopia and Ethiopianism, as the following video clearly shows. On another note, Professor Alamayehu Gebramariam writes that there is substantial evidence Hillary Clinton, Susan Rice, and Samantha Power were the three principal advocates of war against Libya in 2011, setting the North African nation on a free fall ever since. Since November 2020, the likes of Susan Rice, Anthony Blinken, and Jake Sullivan have been openly and publicly looking for Ethiopia's breaking point, he has argued. Now, in this connection, the director of the Institute for Peace and Security Studies at the Addis Ababa University, Dr. Yunus Adai, has told us the following over the phone. Take a listen to this.
The most important point is whether she truly is worried about Ethiopia, or maybe for their previous commitment to the previous, particularly TPLF-led EPRDF government. So it is quite open question to the entire international community. So in my personal view, I think it is quite good to see it from at least 2-3 angles. The first one is this person has been working for such a long time, over maybe 10 to 20 years, to my understanding. When I see her textbooks, her excellent work on humanitarian dignities, she might be concerned, as we saw in some parts of Africa and Europe. However, when you come back to Ethiopian situation, I think it seems to be a lip service. We must be very careful. Secondly, it is also good for us to notice that people listen to what they like to listen to rather than what you tell them. People see what they like to see rather than what is objectively on the ground. So, to my understanding, the concern, the worry is more of why TPLF should be leaving its control in the command center and be away from the remote control from Washington, D.C. So that's really what I can possibly say.
Now, asked by the BBC about the difficulty of getting aid to Tigray regional state, the Atlantic Council's deputy director of the Center for Africa said the cause is the TPLF itself. The director said although the government of Ethiopia had declared a unilateral ceasefire, the TPLF terrorist group has not stopped fighting with neighboring Amhara and Afar regional states. She also described the TPLF clique as a group that has been torturing Ethiopians for over 30 years. Let's take a look.
There are fears that this crisis could worsen given further fighting. Let's get more on this story for you. Bronwyn Bruton is the Deputy Director of the Africa Centre at the Atlantic Council in Washington. Bronwyn, thanks for joining us on BBC News. What are you hearing about the ability of these aid trucks to get through?
Well, obviously, it's been a tremendous challenge for aid agencies to get through to Tigray for a number of different reasons. One of them being that the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, which is the rebel group that's fighting the Ethiopian army, has not accepted a ceasefire that's been implemented by the Ethiopian government and has expanded its war outside of Tigray into the neighboring regions, including Afar, which is the area that's being used as a staging ground, the only route available indeed to get supplies into Mekelle. And so this has caused an incredible backlog that aid agencies claim is being aggravated by the Ethiopian government.
It must be hard actually for the aid agencies to know where to get the supplies to. They'll be looking at camps, they'll be looking at almost refugee settlements, but people are still on the move.
There is a great deal of population displacement in the region, although it is reported that since the TPLF is now entirely in control of Tigray, that much of those movements have settled down and that the delivery of aid within Tigray itself, once the aid can get in, has actually become a little bit more simple than it was when the area was an active conflict zone.
And you were saying, you know, fighting is still going on, indeed has been spreading. I mean, there are deep roots to this tension, to the anger between the different factions in Ethiopia.
There are. Obviously, the TPLF was a dictatorship for almost 30 years, and it ruled Ethiopia brutally. Since the coming to power of Abiy Ahmed, the TPLF has mostly been confined in its own northern region. But in November, it launched an attack on federal forces, which has led to a long and increasingly brutal conflict between the two sides. There's an insurgency that's underway in Tigray, and the TPLF has threatened even to march on Addis Ababa in an effort to retake power at the national level. This has obviously caused Ethiopians who lived in terror of the TPLF for decades to feel a great deal of fear and anger. And it's leading to reprisals, particularly among the Afar and Amhara communities, against aid workers who are trying to deliver aid that they fear will be diverted to the TPLF.
Bronwyn Bruton, thanks very much for joining us from Washington.